is Roger Klemm, and I've known Roger for, I think, over 15 years. He has created 2 community gardens and landscaped 2 yards with native plants. And I believe that his yard was on the Theodore Payne Garden Tour, which is where I first became aware of him. And for quite some time, he was our invasive plant chair, whether he wanted to be or not. But we made him take the chairship because he was the only person in the chapter who was actually doing the work. And he is the instigator and primary caretaker of the Sunland Welcome Nature Garden. And that's the subject of the talk today. So I will let him tell you all about it.
Great, thank you, Orchid. So, yeah, this has been my project for several years. Actually, almost a decade now. I want to show you the garden and kind of explain kind of how it came about, and a little bit about kind of the stories of some of the things that have happened along the way, and then show you some pictures of it right now. Kind of I got my inspiration about this garden, or for this garden, from the wild, and how to bring the beauty of the wild plants into our cultivated landscapes. The pictures you see in the corners are from places on the Haynes Canyon Trail to Mount Lukens in the first year after the station fire. The fire was in 2009. These pictures were from 2010. And the picture in the middle is of the monument sign at the beginning of the garden, front of the garden. So where is this garden anyway? Sunland is on the 210 freeway between Pasadena and Sylmar. Kind of wanted to give you a little bit of the lay of the land. We have the San Gabriel Mountains to the north. The Verdugo Hills are kind of between the San Gabriel Mountains and the Santa Monica Mountains. Sunland is on the east side of the San Fernando Valley. And the garden itself is at a very busy intersection of Sunland Boulevard and the 210 freeway. So the 210 freeway is right next to the garden, or the garden's right next to the freeway, depending how you want to look at it. Looking at it a little bit different, showing the landforms, there's the San Gabriel Mountains to the north and east, the Tujunga Wash, Big Tujunga Canyon, there to the north as well. Here's the garden right next to the freeway, and the Verdugo Hills just on the other side. The garden itself is this parcel right here, Sunland Boulevard and Fenwick Street. And if you're going on the 210 freeway, traveling from Pasadena to Sylmar, and you get off at Sunland Boulevard, you're literally right at the other side of this intersection, and you're looking straight at the garden. I will talk a little bit about this parcel here, which we call the Wildflowering Annex, and you'll see why in a minute. And in a couple of pictures, you see a Ralph's shopping center or Sizzler restaurant. That's right across the street here as well. So just kind of wanted to give you a little bit of context for the area. A little bit more context here again, looking at the overhead view. What is it like at that garden? It's, as I mentioned, it's right next to Sunland Boulevard and the 210 freeway. Very, very busy traffic, very public location. Basically, anytime you are on either the main garden property or the Wildflowering Annex, you are visible to the public. You're out there. And we're in the northeast San Fernando Valley. We're sunny and warm. Back in September when we had that really hot day, it was 114 degrees here. So yeah, it gets toasty. How'd the garden get started? Well, in the aftermath of the station fire, which was August and September and a little bit of into October, I believe, of 2009, that next spring, I was fortunate enough to attend some ecology talks about fire recovery or fire response, and then a plant walk led by Cassie Aoyagi, one of the principals of Form LA Landscaping, and also at the time board president of Theodore Payne Foundation. And she led us into the burn area here in Haynes Canyon, and I got hooked. Just seeing the recovery, the wildflowers and the plants sprouting and the resprouting from the fire was just very inspiring to me. So yeah, nature is inspiring. I took several more hikes and bike rides up on that trail in the next few months. These pictures here are, I believe, from May on that Haynes Canyon Trail, May of 2010. When our chaparral has had enough time to recover from fire, then when a fire occurs, you get this exuberance of wildflowers and plants resprouting that is just, it's a joy to behold. And I feel fortunate that I was able to experience that in this location. I also felt inspired by the mature chaparral in the Verdugo Hills across the freeway, how it can look so lush and green in the spring, and then in the summer, as certain things dry out and there are some flowers and some seeds and different colors and textures, the chaparral presents as the wonderful complex mosaic that it is. And the more I'm out in the wild, the more I try to think, well, how could we bring this into our cultivated landscapes? And so that was my inspiration for this garden. Then the community entrance garden struck me as a pretty much a monoculture of fountain grass, which is an invasive exotic plant. Really stupid plant, shouldn't have it, and it takes over our wild areas and doesn't give any ecological benefit. It's it's more flammable than the chaparral it displaces. It provides no benefit for wildlife. It just, oh, it's nasty stuff. How can we do something? How can we bring the wild beauty, the authentic wild beauty, into our cultivated landscapes? And so I and another native plant friend, kind of in an offhanded comment in an email, said, hey, wouldn't it be nice if the city could do something about this fountain grass? Well, we connected with our city council person's deputy, who was a native plant friend. And she said, well, the city's not going to do anything about it, but you can. It's like, oh. She says, yeah, the city has this program called Adopt a Median. And with that program in the city of Los Angeles, community groups can adopt a property from the city and be the stewards, be the caretakers of that property. I said, huh, that's interesting. So I looked into it and yeah, we can do it. So I kind of got to work. Since I'm a plant geek, I got permission to collect some seeds and cuttings from some of the local trails. And I started growing plants and said, okay, here's what we'll do. I very quickly realized that due to the size of the property and the several hundred plants that would need to be grown for it, that there was no way I was going to fit that all on my patio. So I invested in these Stewie and Sons pots. There's containers and D-pots primarily, because that was a way to grow the number of plants that I would need for this project, and in the space that I had available. Also want to note that I did reach out to Theodore Payne Foundation, which is about 2 miles from my house, and I'm familiar with the organization and friendly with the people there. I've volunteered there in the past. I reached out to them to see, well, do they grow local native plants? Actually, I need to back up. Part of my inspiration for this project is not only to bring native plants to this garden site, but to bring the local native plants. So the plants from the local environment, that local genetic heritage, I felt was very important. And that was kind of my guiding principle is what of the local native plants would be both good garden subjects and, uh, you know, can I actually grow? Because not all of them are easy to propagate and all that kind of stuff. So I reached out to Theodore Payne Foundation, said, do you grow any plants from local genetic stock? And I said, yeah, we do. I said, well, could I have you guys, kind of contract grow? And I said, well, no, we're not set up for that. And we're not set up to track the heritage of the plants to the point of sale. So I said, okay, fine. So then I went off and did my own because they were not set up to kind of do what I thought needed to be happen for this garden. So that's how I got into propagating all of these myself, is because nobody that I knew grew the local native plants. In the thousands of plants that I've grown for this, some of them are really fun. This I think was either this would be a either lemonade berry or sugar bush, one of the roots, integrifolia or ovata. And some of the root structures, on these seedlings are just fun, just neat to look at when you propagate them up, pot them up. So I was growing a bunch of plants for this Adopt a Median program. Since it's a landscaping project, the city wants to know, as part of your application, what's your plan? What are you going to do? What do you propose to do? And so I said, well, I need a plan. I was familiar with Cassie Oyagi from Form LA, and I said, hey, Cassie, would you guys be willing to help organize, make a coherent garden out of these 50 plus species of local native plants that I'm growing? And Cassie says, yeah, this looks like a cool project. We really want to support this work. And so Form LA Landscaping donated the design services for this project. They drew up the plans for us for free, which I'm very honored that they chose to spend their effort helping out on this way. So what are the plants? Well, in looking through the herbarium records of what grows in the Verdugo Hills, turns out there were some surveys done in the early 2000s. Naomi Fraga who's a member of this chapter, works as a botanist at now California Botanic Garden, used to be Rancho Santa Ana. She was involved in those surveys, and I saw her name on a lot of the herbarium records. There are over 300 species of native plants documented since the year 2000 in just the Verdugo Hills. Really quite impressive biodiversity, which those of us who are familiar with native plants shouldn't be surprised. When I was going out looking for plants and collecting material, seeds and cuttings, I was looking for plants in July and August that looked nice, that looked presentable, that I would put in my yard. Things like Artemisia californica, which actually is in the garden. Cassie wanted me to include that, and I'm glad I did. That would not have been my first choice, because it's a wonderful plant, but it looks ratty in the summer. Deerweed is another one that to me looks ratty, looks like a pile of twigs in July and August. And I would not recommend it for somebody's garden because of that. But things like California buckwheat, it looks nice year round. It may be kind of rust colored in the summer because you see the seeds, but there are leaves on it. It's not a pile of twigs. It's worth looking at. And that's what my focus was here with this garden is I want to have a garden with plants that people are going to like the way they look all year round. They're not going to complain that they look like twigs in the middle of summer. And with the exception of Neal's Barberry, which I think there's a grand total of 1 plant in Lopez Canyon, which is farther out from the garden than I was initially collecting. Uh, so Neals Barberry, I think, is an important plant for this area, but it is not available locally. It's been extinct in the wild locally for decades. Everything else here that's on this list and that's in the garden is stuff that I've grown. So where did these plants come from? Well, the garden is right here. This the blue marker and the purple circle. The red places are where I have collected plants: the Tujunga Wash, Haynes Canyon Trail to Mount Lukens, the Verdugo Hills, Hostetter, Whiting Woods, Stowe. Those are the places that these plants come from. From the garden, I can look and see Mount Lukens. That's line of sight. And so I kind of, in my mind, that's my concept, is that's kind of as far away as I want to go. I want the plants to be kind of real near their home. There've been a few fun, kind of interesting things along the way. We adopted the garden. The adoption became final in late February of 2013. Literally a couple of weeks before that, a semi truck didn't make it down the freeway off ramp in a controlled fashion, ran into the corner of the garden and caught fire. And when I saw this on some of the community Facebook groups, the post about this accident, I chuckled. I was like, yeah, we're adopting this garden, and just got run into. It was actually kind of funny because the as part of our plan for this garden, we wanted to replace these signs that the city had put up when they landscaped the area, uh, 10 or so years before. We wanted to put them up. We wanted to replace these signs with our own, which we eventually did, but this just made it all the more reasonable to do that. So once the adoption was final, gathered with Cassie Oyagi, her husband Kirk, and their son Yoshi, who's a few years older by now. The former LA designer Stephanie Reed, who was the one that did the lion's share of the design, and we did a ceremony of ripping out of a few fountain grass plants, and that felt really good to start making a dent on this. At about the same time, we noticed that the irrigation manifold got vandalized. So that was kind of a bummer. And I was kind of concerned that because the letter of the law, the terms of the adoption from the city is that we are responsible for maintaining this property. And I looked at that and went, I had not counted on replacing an irrigation manifold. Fortunately, the city staff stepped up and they replaced it. So so that was nice. And then we gathered literally dozens of volunteers from the community on 3 consecutive weekends to rip out fountain grass and plant our local native plants. So it was a lot of work, but as they say, many hands make light work, and we got them all out, and we got our plants in the ground, and planting day was beautiful, as planting days usually are. You can see our new irrigation manifold with vandalism protection. We were able to get mulch donated from a local tree company. I think at this point, the single most expense that I had, money that I had spent on the garden had been the postage to send the drawings to the city. Everything else had been donated. Now that's of course not counting all of the pots and other materials that I purchased for the propagating effort, but I count that as my hobby. And as I said, many hands make light work. It takes a village, all of that kind of stuff. Fortunate to have built friendships in the community of people who are interested in helping out and doing something, genuinely beneficial for the community and for the environment. So that in 2013, we adopted the garden. We did ripped out the fountain grass and planted in the spring and in the fall. So we planted the main garden, and we were looking across the street there to this wildflowering annex that I mentioned, and we kind of had our goal set on doing something there, doing the same kind of adopt a median project with the city. And so we had started down that path, but hadn't gotten very far when we came across this art project that was the Theodore Payne Foundation was involved with. I've forgotten who else, but we were one of 50 sites in Los Angeles County to be a part of this wildflowering LA, where basically sow wildflowers and see what happens, and tend the areas, and then in April have a show of all of the wildflowers, and it was a fun time. However, we discovered that this parcel had an abundance of weeds, and that first year the wildflowers were kind of a bust. So then that summer we, in addition to drawing up the plans uh, for this adopt a median program for that parcel, we also did soil solarization so that while the weeds wouldn't be quite as much of a problem in subsequent years. And it worked pretty well. It actually knocked the weeds down by about 90%. Another part of the garden plan that we had submitted plans to the city. Another part of it was signage, having some interpretive signs in this one section of the garden, signs that explain about local biodiversity, invasive exotic plants, water-wise landscaping, why plant native. So, somebody can just come to this garden, look around, read these signs, and have some appreciation for why this garden is the way it is. And this signage project was one that oh, and also replacing that monument sign at the beginning, at the front of the garden, that had been a city provided sign announcing the second council district, when by the time we got there, we were no longer the second district, we were the seventh. So the sign needed to be replaced anyway. And we just replaced it with our own version rather than what the city would have done. This whole signage program was about $4,000 worth of materials purchased. Was very fortunate to be involved with some of our local art community to draw up to make these an artistic presentation, and the text in there also. I worked with a couple of people on that, also with including quotes from early people in the community. So it worked out really well. We were able to get a grant from the Metropolitan Water District for some of the cost of this project, and we also did a crowdfunding campaign, and the community stepped up and with about half of the funds. So again, it all worked out, and it was a good project. So in the first year, we removed fountain grass, turned it from an invasive exotic monoculture to this, as Cassie Oyagi from Farm LA describes it, a sea of buckwheat punctuated by some other things. So here you can see California buckwheat is the primary plant in the main part of the garden. And here's some white sage as punctuation. And actually, there's not a whole lot else of punctuation right here that you can see, but we'll see that in subsequent slides. As things grew, the plants in the back of the garden are some of the chaparral shrubs, the lemonade berry, the sugar bush, toyon. They grow as big bushes and by nature keep their branches all the way to the ground. As is the case in many places nowadays, where there are places to hide, people will hide there. So we trimmed the bushes to make it less appealing for them to hide. And when there's trash in the garden, it gets taken care of. It disappears. And we haven't, we had one episode where a homeless person camped out and wouldn't leave. City came by and eventually kicked him out. Other than that, it's been pretty manageable. After a few years of the wildflowers on the slope areas of the wildflowering annex and struggling with keeping the weeds at bay, some of my community friends said, hey, can we do something, dress up this area and make something that looks a little bit nicer year round? And they worked on me and finally got me to do something, be willing to do something different. We, the Sunland Tahunga Neighborhood Council Beautification Committee got funds to get some rocks here. So we put a little border around the garden that those rocks then echo the rocks on the other side that are part of the theme of the garden. And then we put some low growing cultivars, native cultivars. So this is Salvia Bee's Bliss. There's Ceanothus Mills Glory, Eriogonum Wild Cascade, and around it, elsewhere there's Salvia Terraseca. So low growing native plant cultivars that I expect will be able to grow there without supplemental irrigation because this side has no irrigation system. So I hand water until things are established. And things are doing pretty well there. And these are pictures from last year. Going from a sea of fountain grass to a sea of buckwheat. And it's beautiful because the buckwheat has the appropriate seasonal changes. In the summer, it's got the creamy white flowers. In the fall, it's got the rust seed heads. Excuse me. And we have some punctuation. We have some yuccas. We have some of the bigger chaparral shrubs in the back. We even have some big berry manzanita in the far back corner. So it's, and with the native plants, I see the native insects. So we have bees, we have butterflies, different spiders, things that I haven't, a lot of them I don't know, but they're unique. I mentioned line of sight to Mount Lukens. Here's Mount Lukens. Again, going from a fountain grass monoculture to this sea of buckwheat punctuated by other things. So here's the white sage in the middle, punctuating this rambunctious sea of California buckwheat. There are some Eastwood manzanitas that we planted in literally a hole in the rock kind of riprap area here. And I hand watered this plant for the first summer, and it's been on rainfall alone in this hot, blazing sun, and it's doing just great. Oh, kind of a funny thing in that in the early days of the project, some community friends would come help me with the weeding, and they one of them tied a little flag on the fence every time she weeded. It's like, okay, I've been here, I've weeded, and that was kind of fun. And you can see in the intervening almost 8 years, the bushes in the back have grown up. They now pretty much hide the fence. Here's Coyote brush and California sagebrush in amongst the buckwheat. Again, a sea of buckwheat with some punctuation. It's been really rewarding to be tending this garden for long enough that plants that that take a while to grow and mature have done so. I've heard it said that Chaparral yucca takes from 5 to 10 years to grow and set seed, to flower. In year 7, 2 of the yuccas decided to bloom, and that just really put a smile on my face, that this garden has been here long enough that some of the things we planted that are, have a life cycle that's a decade or so long, they've now grown and are completing their life cycle. And I, in fact, just today put some seeds from this yucca in some dirt to make the next generation of yucca plant here in case they don't sprout on their own. So that's kind of fun. The other plant that I have been kind of watching, plants that I've been watching for signs that they have matured, is the manzanitas. We have big berry manzanita in the garden, and we have Eastwood manzanita in the garden. And at least one individual of each of those has now bloomed. And manzanita in the wild can take 10 or 20 years to burn, 10 or 20 years to bloom after a fire. They are fire followers. Their seeds germinate after a fire, and they can take 10 and 20 years to set their first, to bloom and set their first crop of seeds. I actually witnessed this in the wild as well. The station fire happened in 2009, and last year I noticed that there were some manzanitas in that burn area, some big berry manzanitas that had just bloomed. So a decade. There are plants in the garden that have volunteered. A great many of the plants that volunteer are weeds, and I pulled them. But there are a few plants that show up that are native. When I recognize that they are a native plant and they are in okay locations, I leave them. I figure they have a right to be here. This is a native plant garden. Diversity is good. I enjoy and appreciate the natives that show up. So deerweed, while I might not have planted it myself, there are deerweed in a few places and I let them grow. They're a valuable part of our ecosystem and I appreciate that they're here. Cliff aster shows up in a few places. I did not plant it. I think it's wonderful. Everlasting shows up. We have 2 species of it. Datura, which I think their flowers are so pretty. Wire lettuce, Stephanomeria. We had that in abundance this last year. And this one, which I had never seen before until it showed up in the garden, and it showed up. I looked it up, and doveweed, and it's just a neat little gray hemisphere plant in the middle of summer. You never see these until after essentially all of the rain has happened. I have no idea how the seeds germinate because they do so when it's dry. I don't get it, but anyway, they're fun. And I appreciate that we have plants, wild plants, volunteering in the garden. It's part of what makes this garden special. I've also seen this one indication of hybridization. We have white sage and black sage in the garden, and I noticed there's this one sage growing in amongst the white that isn't quite a white sage. It's a little bit different. And the flowers are different also in a way that makes me absolutely sure that this is a hybrid between black and white sage. There are a few species of plants in this garden that are vigorous colonizers. California buckwheat, of which there's a lot in the garden, you can see it's kind of almost crowding out this one manzanita. This is an Eastwood manzanita that we planted in a little hole in the rock work here, and this California buckwheat moved in, and well, they're coexisting, but I actually have been doing a little trimming on the buckwheat, and I intend to trim some more because, you know, I planted the manzanita. I don't want it to get overrun. But the California buckwheat has colonized areas where other things weren't growing. And I let it go. I let it colonize in most places. The other one that has been a pretty vigorous colonizer is this California fuchsia. And it has grown up in other places, and some places I let it grow, and other places it's trying to take over where I don't want it to, and so I end up pulling it out. I call these plants the colonizers because they have grown where they were planted, and they are also growing elsewhere, as opposed to the wanderers, which I planted in one place. They grew, set seed, and died, and now they're elsewhere in the garden. So these guys, I call them the wanderers because they didn't stay put. They are growing elsewhere, and they just had to find the right place, find the happy places, and they have. And I'm happy that they uh, grow where they choose. I do have some problem children, plants that I have had trouble either propagating or growing. Um, some of them you wouldn't be surprised. Woolly blue curls is known to be not an easy plant to grow. um, I think in most places in the garden, the soil is too heavy for it, too fine grained. I have planted it in several places in the garden, and in some places it doesn't even grow. It just dies right away. In other places it grows, dies, and in one season. So in one place, I remember one plant, it just looked gorgeous in the spring, was full of flowers, and then 2 months later it died. This particular individual has been growing and happy for like 2 or 3 years. So evidently it found a happy place. Um, Ceanothus oleganthus, I have planted it 2 or 3 times, and it just doesn't make it. You can see this one's not happy. It's on its way out. Ceanothus crassifolius are one of the other local species of Ceanothus. Uh, I love it dearly. It's wonderful in the wild. In the wild, it grows for decades. I've seen some plants that have had to have been 30 and 50 and 100 years old. Um, in the garden, it grew wonderfully, bloomed, it was gorgeous, and then it died. I am growing more, so I have just planted more, but it was just very fast growing. I think it lived a grand total of about 3 years. There's some other plants, bush poppy, that I have had trouble propagating and trouble growing, trouble planted in the garden. There's the local silk tassel, Garrya viacii, that I was able to grow some. I planted them in the garden, and they just sat there and didn't do anything. They didn't die right away, but they didn't grow. And then a year later, they just kind of died. There've been a couple others problems, some of which I am still working on growing and planting, but yeah, gardens evolve, and other things in general I have either planted in their places or let other things fill in. And this, I think, is the most rewarding part of this garden, is the insects and other creatures that live in this garden, that came to this garden because of the plants that we put in this garden and that we let grow in this garden. Um, I, monarch butterflies, I don't often see them, and we actually don't yet have milkweed in the garden, but there was one that showed up one day. Spittlebugs, I'm not real familiar with the part they play in the ecology, but they're cool. Spiders, I don't know what spiders these are. This one I believe is a milkweed beetle. Just all kinds of different stuff. caterpillars. I think this is the Sphinx, white-lined Sphinx moth caterpillar. And this one, I don't know what it is, but and the lizards are great. I love the little lizards. And I see hummingbirds, and sometimes when I'm in the garden, I'll hear the bush tits. So yeah, the garden, and that's part of what's really gratifying about all these insects and the lizards and the birds is the garden is alive. And that's this really special part that I think is the part that I really think is special about a native plant garden is that the garden is alive. You have created the you've created the conditions by having the right plants there, that you have all of this life that wouldn't be there if you weren't doing if you hadn't planted those plants. One of the plants that I really enjoy in this garden is this Davidson's bush mallow. The leaves are just wonderfully, well, when you touch them, they're wonderful and velvety. If they're brushing up against you, they're itchy. It's a wonderful plant, and this is one that I have to be careful with in the garden. I have to protect it against rabbits because the rabbits will eat every single one the night after I plant it. So I put a cage around it. Cage doesn't have to be very tall, but I have to put a cage around it every single one I plant. And fortunately, I learned this. I had enough plants to discover this with, and I now do that every time. The other thing that's gratifying is when I see native plants that I'm growing in the garden, and this is a chia sage. When they start colonizing the sidewalk cracks, then I've done something right. Here's just some of the organizations that I have interacted with over the course of the project. Theodore Payne Foundation is the local place for native plant information and material. The Metropolitan Water District has some kind of good general information about landscaping in water conserving landscaping. And they were a wonderful help with the signage program. The grant from them. This Adopt a Median program for anybody in the city of Los Angeles. This is the program through which you can, you being a community group, not you as an individual, but as a community group, can adopt a property from the city that kind of needs help. In my case, I engaged with the Sunland Tujunga Neighborhood Council, and they are the signatory agency, the signatory community group on the Adopt a Median program, the adoptions. The signs were by a company called Paneer Graphics. They produce signs for the national parks, and they were wonderful to deal with, and their signs are wonderful. They've been in the ground out there for what, 2014, now 2020, 21, 6 and change years, and they look just as good now as the day we put them in. So they're wonderful. Form LA Landscaping, again, they were very generous to us with the design, doing the design of pro bono. They are very knowledgeable about native plant and native plant landscaping, native and sustainable landscaping. And then if you want, look up Sunland Welcome Nature Garden on Facebook. We have a Facebook page. I occasionally post pictures of the garden. So yeah. And as I mentioned in a couple places, it would not have happened without a whole lot of people. We have a sign on the property to recognize the different organizations that have helped us with this garden. And there are many individuals that have been a part of this garden, and I very much appreciate their help. And with that, here are two of my favorite plants in the garden, the scarlet larkspur and the woolly blue curls. Edward Abbey was quite a character in the, I believe, 60s and 70s in the Western United States. And whenever I talk about native plants, this quote just comes to mind. There is science, logic, reason. There is thought verified by experience. And then there's California. Our California native plants are neat. They're fun. They're interesting. They're odd. And I love them for that. Scarlet larkspur is one that most other larkspurs, delphiniums, most other members of the genus are blue flowers. It's one of the very few that's not blue. And it graces our local mountains in Southern California, and I love it. And fortunately, I'm able to grow it in the garden. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed hearing about the Welcome Garden. And if you are ever on the 210 freeway going from Pasadena to Sylmar, so going westbound on the 210, I encourage you to get off at the Sunland Boulevard exit. Even if you just jog left on Sunland and then right back on the freeway, just take a look at the garden. And if you want to stop, turn up the street just past the garden, Olive Grove. Go halfway up the street, park, and walk down and just walk around the garden. I think you'll appreciate it.
And that's a great transition, Roger. That was actually one of the questions that someone asked was, how can we park so we can enjoy this?
Yeah. Actually, let me share again and look back. Because fairly early on, sorry.
That aerial that had the.
Yeah, I'm going back to the aerial shot. Okay, am I sharing?
You are not.
I'm not. Okay, let me. Okay, I'll share again. So here's the 210 freeway from Pasadena to Sylmar. Here's, as you're going through the Verdugo Hills, you come out of the Verdugo Hills and down into the Tonga Wash. That's where Sunland Boulevard exit is. You get off at Sunland Boulevard at the exit, and you go straight across. You're on Fenwick Street, turn left on Olive Grove, and about halfway up the block, there's a basically no parking sign from there back. And so as long as you're above that no parking sign, you're good. And so you just park along the street here and walk down and take a look at the garden. The interpretive section of the garden with those signs, you can see two of the signs right there, and the sponsor sign is right there. There's some shade underneath the oak trees. It's a nice place to just sit and watch and look and hang out. So yeah, I would invite you to take a look.
Great. And then the next couple of questions had to do with the fountain grass. So we had a pair of questions. One, your method that you find effective for removing the fountain grass.
Mm-hmm.
And two, where did you dispose of
it? So fountain grass, fortunately for removing it, does not have very substantial roots. So basically, I took a digging bar and a pickaxe, and you just basically dig in with the pickaxe and you know, kind of lever it out. Just dig a little bit around, a little bit at a time, and pick it out, and it comes out pretty easily that way. You saw in the picture of us with the initial removal, there wasn't much root there. As far as disposal, we basically put it in bags that the city had provided and then called the city for a bulky item pickup. So it went along with trash wherever the trash goes.
Roger, along those same lines, did you have a problem with the residual seed bank of the fountain grass?
Fortunately, not much. We did have, there have been a few sprouts, but not much at all. We mulched quite heavily, and we were pulling weeds for a couple of years, but and we still are. I mean, there are places where weeds are annual weeds are a perennial problem, but the fountain grass really wasn't that bad trying to reestablish itself.
And speaking of establishment, Andrew Firth is asking, now that things are established, do you irrigate much?
Good question. These are all local native plants, so in theory, we don't need to irrigate at all. However, and for a while, I wasn't irrigating much. Then after the Latuna fire burned literally up to the other side of the freeway, so within probably 300 feet of the garden, I realized, well, maybe I should keep the garden a little bit hydrated. So since then, I have been watering about once every 4 weeks or so in the dry season. And then the last few years, since we have not gotten the fall rainfall here that I expect, or that we would historically, I have been, once the weather cools down, once the heat breaks in late October, early November, I then go water, turn the irrigation on once a week for a while. So this year I watered in November and December for about 6 weeks until we got some rain.
Great. Then an easy question, hopefully. Kathy Sturdivant asked if that was you driving the truck in the one photo. Or...
No, not me. I have never had an accident like that.
And then Barbara Eisenstein has a series of questions. So let's start with how often do volunteers, including you, work in the park at this point?
So I have pretty much had a program of spending at least a little bit of time there every single weekend. So every single weekend I will go with if nothing else, I go and I pick up trash. Because it's such a public location and busy location, trash is going to accumulate. So every week I go and pick up trash. I might not do anything else, but I'll do that. In the season, like right now, I spend a little bit more time and I pull weeds. Sometimes in the fall, I'll do some trimming. Typically, a couple times a year, I will gather other people together and we will have a group maintenance event. So yeah, twice a year, I gather like 5 or 10 people to help me. The rest of the time, it's pretty much just me, but I am there every week. And I think that's part of the keeping the homeless people from becoming a problem is I happen to be there at times of day when they're not. And so stuff just disappears. Anything that gets left there because I'm cleaning up the garden.
Okay. And then two kind of paired questions from her. What would you have done different, if anything, knowing what you know now? And do you have any big plans for the future?
What would I have done differently? I'm not sure I would have done anything differently. I think it's kind of, I've done what needed to happen and it's kind of has all worked out. As far as for the future, there are still plants I'm trying to grow. I've got a flat of Trichostoma seeds, Dendromecan seeds, and Arundorferia, the golden eardrops, that have sat there for a while. I threw some liquid smoke seasoning on them, and now we'll see what sprouts. So hopefully some of those will make their way into the garden. I just recently kind of got into the geophytes. So some Blumeria, some Calochortus, and actually we have 2 different delphiniums recently went in on the wildflowering annex. So here's hoping that they make it. I've got some additional wildflowers, and I'm trying to get Phacelia grandiflora. I was able to get a bunch of seed from that from the Verdugo Hills after the Latuna fire, and I'm hoping to somehow get that to grow in the wildflowering annex. So those are kind of things I've got in the works.
And then are we out of time, Cliff, or could he do a couple more?
Cliff, you're muted.
It seemed like it was enough words for a yes. So yes. Mickey Long asked if anyone has inventoried, other than through your photos, the arthropods and birds on the site.
Not that I know of. Not that I know of. That would be really cool.
And Bill Neal has asked if you would grow seedlings for other projects.
Possibly, although and part of I'm interested too. It becomes a matter of getting around to it. There are other things that have taken my attention in the last few years, and so the propagation has kind of taken a backseat, as evidenced by my having just a couple of hours ago finally gotten this year's seed propagation into dirt in advance of the rain, which is happening right now. So willing, but it probably won't happen. I'm sorry. That being said, there are a bunch of plants that I have been growing, and I like to keep a stock on hand for other community projects. And so I have given a few plants here and there to people as they're doing things. So yeah.
And then the last one we've got is the last one of Barbara's. Do you have gophers? And if so, how do you handle them?
We do have gophers at the wildflowering annex, and I do hire an exterminator from time to time that does trapping. They're the same people I hire for my own yard, and they trap, because that's if you don't do something about them, they will totally destroy the area. So I wish I could be patient enough to have a natural solution, but that's what I do. I think there are squirrels on the main garden site, and they have not been a real big problem. So.
Well, that was all the questions that we had.
Okay.
So thank you, Roger.
You're very welcome.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Roger. That was very interesting, and maybe inspire some other people to
Hope so.
do that either in a public space or in their own personal yards. I highly recommend it.
Yeah.
Okay. With that, we'll adjourn, and hopefully see you all next month, in February 25, and go out and take advantage of this weather.
Yes.
It's raining right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, enjoy the rain. It's on its way.
Okay. Have a good night, everybody.
Yeah. Take care, everybody. Good night.
It was a
Okay.
great presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Happy to share.
Thanks, Roger.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye, Roger. Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go.